It's Friday, the 14th of October. This is Politics Live. As the Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng meets the Prime Minister inside Downing Street for urgent talks on their economic plans, Liz Truss will hold a press conference later today. Joining me today, the Daily Telegraph's Tony Diver, Times Radio Charlotte Ivers and the Daily Mirror political editor John Stevens. The Chancellor left Washington DC in the middle of the night to fly home. His plane arrived at Heathrow an hour and a half ago. As he made his way back to London, speculation is mounting about a major U-turn on his mini-budget and about his own future. This morning, ministers were insisting the economy is in safe hands.
I've worked very closely with the Prime Minister before. When I was previously at Trade, she was the Trade Secretary. I worked very closely with Kwasi Kwarteng, and I see two people very determined to get the country growing again.
But there's pressure from many Tory MPs for another U-turn.
Do it now. Make sure it's something significant, not just nibbling at the edges, but something that's going to be firm, bold and convincing.
Well, welcome to this Politics Live special. Events are developing really minute by minute. We now understand that Kwasi Kwarteng, the Chancellor, is inside number 10 Downing Street in discussions with Liz Truss about their economic plans and about his future. Let's have a look at this tweet from Stephen Swinford at The Times, political editor. I'm told that Kwasi Kwarteng is being sacked as Chancellor as Liz Truss prepares to reverse the mini-budget. Not clear who will be replacing him. Events moving very, very quickly. Number 10 not commenting. And this is because of a U-turn that we have been expecting over the last 24 hours to do with corporation tax. This is Ben Riley-Smith at The Telegraph. Exclusive corporation tax will rise to 25% from 19% this April. Liz Truss will announce at 2 p.m. press conference today. We are expecting that to happen in the next couple of hours. A huge climb down, sticking to Rishi Sunak's original plan, remove central plank of her leadership bid. It's not the only U-turn that has happened, Tony, but first of all about Kwasi Kwarteng and his position as Chancellor. If this U-turn is announced this afternoon, is it untenable for him to remain as Chancellor?
Well, I mean, the Chancellor did an interview with The Telegraph this morning in which he said that there wouldn't be any of these U-turns, that he would be remaining in post. He spent the last few days at the IMF in Washington trying to convince the international markets and other world leaders that what he and Liz Truss are trying to do with that mini-budget isn't going to cause a financial crisis and can continue. Now, it seems that while he's been away, there's been a bit of plotting going on in Downing Street. It seems that the Prime Minister believes at this point that she can't carry on with these measures, that Tory party is too unhappy. And therefore, yeah, I think it's pretty difficult to see how he can continue, given that up to this point he's been very much sticking to his guns.
And it has been very dramatic, Charlotte, because we've had Kwasi Kwarteng getting the last flight out of Washington, D.C. and arriving here and going straight to Downing Street while all this speculation is continuing. But yesterday, we were already hearing that perhaps corporation tax would rise after all. And just to explain to viewers, of course, there was this commitment that it wouldn't, that they would cancel that rise. What does this say about Liz Truss's position?
Well, it's immensely tricky for Liz Truss because she has been moving hand in glove with Kwasi Kwarteng. She has repeatedly put her confidence in him, and we know that this project is her project as well as his. My colleague, of course, Steve Swinford, now reporting that Kwasi Kwarteng's job is on the line. The question is, will that be enough to save Liz Truss from two separate threats? Firstly, the threat from the markets, from the economic pressure she's under, but also the threat from her own MPs, who are deeply unhappy with what they're seeing. Reports on the front page of the Times today about the potential for overthrowing Liz Truss. We're weeks into her premiership, and already those conversations are taking place very seriously.
I mean, it does seem incredible. Before I come to you, John, I think we're going to go to Downing Street and speak to the BBC's political correspondent, Layla Nathu, who is outside Number 10. It does seem incredible, Layla, that it was just over 4 weeks ago that Liz Truss became Prime Minister, that she appointed Kwasi Kwarteng as her Chancellor, as we were just hearing there from Charlotte, and they have reiterated they're in lockstep. What are you hearing?
I think it's absolutely dizzying the pace at which things are moving, Jo. I mean, to be a fly on the wall behind those doors in Downing Street right now, where Kwasi Kwarteng and Liz Truss are clearly holding discussions about what to do with that mini budget. I mean, if you just compare the words that we were hearing from Number 10 this morning, the Chancellor, as you say, and the Prime Minister are in lockstep. You had Greg Hands, a minister, talking about absolutely no plans to change anything. The Prime Minister, at Prime Minister's Questions just on Wednesday, defending not raising corporation tax, saying it would be the wrong thing at a time when we're trying to attract investment. Just think about the political humiliation if she is to have to row back on that, which is widely what is expected at that press conference we are going to hear this afternoon. Now, we know that the Chancellor himself is not going to be at that press conference. The press conference is going to be led by the Prime Minister, so you can read into that what you will. At the moment, Number 10 not commenting on all these reports that Kwasi Kwarteng is to lose his job. But of course, as Charlotte was saying, his position is intimately connected with her own. She has been the one to campaign on this platform of tax cuts for her leadership of the Conservative Party. She has made that case so strongly. She has connected her whole government's purpose to cutting taxes as a way of trying to stimulate growth, something that's tried to differentiate her, as she saw it, from governments, from administrations, Tory administrations that came before. And now to be on the verge of actually junking it after pressure from her own backbenchers. I think it's very difficult to see, if she lets Kwasi Kwarteng go, how she can justify hanging on to her own position.
And in terms of her authority, of course, this is another major U-turn after they decided to cancel the 45p tax rate policy too, and there have been a number of other changes in government policy. Speaking to Tory MPs, as I know you do, what is the sense amongst them? Because yesterday, certainly, people were saying we cannot have another leadership contest within weeks of having just appointed and elected Liz Truss as Prime Minister.
Well, I think this is the issue for Tory MPs, is that they too are boxed in. If you're talking about the Prime Minister and the Chancellor being out of options in terms of where to go next on policy, Tory MPs too are struggling to see if any possible next step is actually a good outcome. And I think the overriding sense among them is despondence and a pretty sense of doom and gloom about the prospects going forward. Because, as you say, a fourth anointing of another leader within a term of government, it does not look like a potentially appetising prospect, especially with all the factions now in place after all these successive governments. There are now so many factions within the Tory party. It's going to be very difficult to agree on who might be that person. And I think, you know, that obviously looming in the distance is a spectre of a general election, which most Tory MPs agree will go down pretty badly for them.
Layla Nathu at Number 10, thank you very much. John, listening to that, let's focus on Conservative MPs. I mean, at a practical level, what can really happen? I have spoken to supporters of Liz Truss, senior supporters of Liz Truss this morning, who are saying people need to stop panicking within the party, that if there is a U-turn, although they don't support it on a key economic policy of the mini-budget, if that calms everything down, they should just be able to carry on. Is that credible?
I think we have to see what the reaction of the markets is to this U-turn later. But clearly, Liz Truss is desperately trying to keep her premiership afloat. She's chucking Kwasi Kwarteng over the side. She's chucking this corporation tax policy over the side. But one of the problems is Kwasi Kwarteng just didn't pluck this policy from nowhere. It was a central plank of Liz Truss's election campaign as leader. Her whole pitch to the Tory party was, I'm going to be a swashbuckling tax cutter.
I'm going to interrupt because he's out. He's been sacked. So Kwasi Kwarteng, the Chancellor, I mean, he can only have been in with Liz Truss for a matter of 10, 15 minutes, if we understood the timing correctly. He's gone. Your reaction?
Well, I think that Liz Truss is still in a really difficult position, and it'll be interesting to see who she brings in as Chancellor instead. Obviously, she's going to make this a moment of big change. She's going to say that she's learnt lessons, that she's going to change the way she's running her government. But what does she do? Does she bring in one of those Rishi Sunak supporters who she vanquished from her cabinet? If she does that, it's still quite hard, because a lot of the most prominent Rishi Sunak supporters, people like Michael Gove, people like Grant Shapps, they spent the last few weeks saying how awful Liz Truss is and how her policies are terrible. So it's very difficult to see how they suddenly come in to number 11 and be her Chancellor.
Well, let's return to number 10, Downing Street, where that sacking actually happened. Leila Nathu is there. Can you tell us anything else, apart from the fact that Kwasi Kwarteng's out?
No, just the confirmation that actually he is out of the job. I mean, he arrived back here, just before midday? It's now 12:25. So, yeah, as you say, pretty short conversation. It was probably clear to him as he flew back on that plane that the writing was on the wall. But he has now been sacked as Chancellor. We expected as much, given that Liz Truss was going to lead that press conference on her own later this afternoon. Presumably that is when she's also going to announce a new Chancellor. I can't imagine the announcement will be that far behind, because there needs to be someone in charge of the economy. So, I mean, having this now gap as to letting go the main ideological soulmate of Liz Truss, the person that she was implementing this project of tax cuts with, I think she is going to have to think very carefully about how she presents this when she stands up later at that press conference, to try to distance herself from the mini budget, because of course this was very much a joint project. Yes, he's the Chancellor, yes, he was delivering it, but in absolutely no way was she disconnected from it, and absolutely no way was she in any way not behind or not campaigning for all of the measures that were coming in. So I think she's going to have to come up with quite a sophisticated justification for why she thinks letting the Chancellor go is going to neutralise the discontent, because I think it throws her own position into one that is very precarious.
Leila Nathu, thank you very much. I mean, Charlotte, it's extraordinary. Just over half an hour ago, and Kwasi Kwarteng was still Chancellor. Now he's out of a job and Liz Truss is looking to appoint somebody else. I mean, first of all, your reaction, and what about her position? Will she be able to do that? Will she be able to distance herself from the Chancellor that she was really attached at the hip with when it came to their economic policies?
It is quite remarkable, isn't it? And I think the thing that I've heard from Conservative MPs over the last couple of days, as we started to get a few of these rumours that the Chancellor's job might be on the line, was that she needs to bring in someone who, as John was saying, would unify the party, would be a unity figure. And the question is, who? Speaking to a very prominent supporter of Rishi Sunak yesterday, who essentially said to me, look, nobody credible would do it. We have all spent all this time trashing her policies. Why on earth would we suddenly step out now and implement them? So the question then is, who is going to accept this? Is there someone who is willing to take it up? And frankly, I don't see them clamouring at this stage in the game.
Tony?
Well, I suppose in a way, the more U-turns there are, the more similar her economic policy becomes to Rishi Sunak. I mean, one of the key points of difference between them during the campaign was that she didn't want to increase corporation tax to 25%. That's what we understand is going to be announced this afternoon. That, in fact, was a Rishi Sunak policy, is in fact also the Labour Party's policy, I think, to support a 25% rate of corporation tax. So I suppose it's possible that you have someone who feels that they're sort of more ideologically aligned with number 10, but I mean, frankly, who would want to join the government at the moment? It doesn't feel hugely stable, does it?
Well, you mentioned Labour, and conveniently, I'm pleased to welcome Emily Thornberry, Shadow Attorney General on Labour's front bench. Your reaction, first of all, that Kwasi Kwarteng's gone?
I think it's quite extraordinary that we have a most humiliating U-turn happening on a policy that has crashed our economy. The most extraordinary event that we have seen in my lifetime, as far as I can see. They, by doing this U-turn, accept that all of this has been their fault. And we're even debating that Liz Truss should remain in her job.
Are you calling for a general election?
I'm saying that what we need to have is we need to have a responsible government, a grown-up government that will look after our finances, that will make proper decisions. And yes, we will only get a credible government of that sort with a Labour government.
So how are you going to make that happen, Emily Thornberry? Because we know, we've been told that Labour Party staff have been telling MPs, like yourself, be on an election war footing. You were obviously expecting something to happen. What are you going to do to make it happen?
Look, they have an 80-seat majority. I mean, that has always been our problem, so it will be up to them. But that's what our country needs. I mean, leaving aside all the party politics, what our country needs is it needs to have a responsible, grown-up government that has some credibility that the markets and that internationally people can believe in. Well, this will be... Otherwise, we will have the fourth Chancellor in a year, and Liz Truss, who got us into all of this trouble, rowing backwards desperately, not knowing where she's going and floundering around.
Yeah.
What good would that do for Britain?
Except if the markets are calmed, and I accept we are speculating to some extent, but actually, as Tony was saying, if they U-turn on any more of the mini-budget, it's going to look very much like a mini-budget that you are fully behind, because the 45p tax rate policy has gone. They are now going to increase corporation tax, which you wanted to see. You do support the reversal of Rishi Sunak's increase in national insurance contributions. There's a mini-budget that you can get behind.
It's not just the reckless way in which they went into the mini-budget.
But you support the policies.
It's the way in which they have been undermining Britain's reputation over such a long period of time. So there has been no long-term plan. So we've just come out of a Boris Johnson government where they were floundering around backwards and forwards and nobody knew where the government was going or what the economic policy was.
What would you do differently then, Emily, on that?
Well, certainly we would not have sacked the guy in charge of the Treasury. We wouldn't have briefed that there would be more tax changes in the future. I mean, it's the way in which they did it. We would never have a budget without there being some form of independent analysis of what it was that we were doing. So they did their mini-budget without the OBR, sacking the guy in charge of the Treasury.
Presentationally...
Not presentationally, more than presentationally, a reckless, arrogant way of charging at our economy, and it is working people who are suffering. It has already happened. All the mortgage rates have gone up, and people are really frightened.
Stay with us. And just to clarify, we know that Kwasi Kwarteng is out as Chancellor. We haven't absolutely confirmed whether he was sacked or whether this was by some sort of mutual agreement. Let's get more reaction, market reaction, hopefully with Darshini David, the BBC's economics correspondent. Welcome to you, Darshini. Any reaction so far to the fact that Kwasi Kwarteng is no longer Chancellor?
Well, Jo, this isn't a sentence I've got used to uttering in the last few weeks, but the reaction has been very muted. And there's a reason for that, because it's not so much the man the markets are concerned about, but the policies. And as we know, they haven't seen as yet what is going to happen there. Now, we did see some reaction earlier in the day on the bond markets. They were looking a bit more relaxed, the kind of movement which in a normal day would look quite drastic, but in the current scheme of things doesn't look that major because of the wild swings we've seen in recent weeks. But they are increasingly hopeful that we are going to see at least a partial reversal of the tax cuts. But those fundamental questions about the credibility of the government and its policies remain. They want to know how these policies, if we do see a reversal of tax cut, what does that mean for growth? Are we really going to see debt coming down in a few years? And how does the new Chancellor, whoever that is, go about it? And what tax cuts remain? And indeed, let's not forget the energy support package. How is all of that going to be funded? Because don't forget, even if we do see some reversals, there is still likely to be a bit of a hole for the government to fill. This idea that the Prime Minister was touting that you can do all of this, still increase spending, and yet bring debt down in a few years, that still is something that many economists think is simply impossible.
Darshini, I spoke to a couple of senior Conservative MPs who back Liz Truss's tax-cutting agenda and saying the markets are reacting to all sorts of countries' economic policies, and they're making comparisons with high levels of inflation in countries like Holland and high interest rates in the US. Are you hearing the same sort of thing?
It's really fascinating, Jo, because when you pick through what the markets have been doing, this is a particularly unsettled time across many economies at the moment. So, yes, it is a particularly febrile time for the markets. But when you try and separate out what we've seen on the UK markets, there has been a more emphatic reaction here, and that the Bank of England, economists, the IMF are all pointing towards domestic policy in particular. And a Chancellor's job, of course, is to think about how policies land. When you've already got markets in a very excitable state, it is always very risky when you unveil major drastic plans, like the one we saw the now former Chancellor Kwasi Kwarteng doing.
Darshini David, thank you very much. We're showing pictures of Kwasi Kwarteng. They're arriving back back in the UK earlier this morning. We now know he is out as Chancellor. We will try and find out the nature of his departure. But let's get some more reaction from our panel. Emily, can I come back to you? You heard there from Darshini David. The bond markets are calmer than perhaps they have been in recent weeks. The reaction generally is muted. It is about the policies. If there are, and there is, I should say, a U-turn on corporation tax, things might just calm down. Do you accept that?
Yeah, I mean, febrile seems to only be a word which is ever used in Westminster in relation to the economy and, you know, how have we got here? I think the markets are pricing in that there will be a change. But, you know, that's why it makes it even more important that there is a change, because, you know, they're holding their breath and waiting to see what happens next, but as presuming that there will be a U-turn. And of course, it's the policies that are important. But there also has to be some form of accountability, in my view, and that accountability has to be, and also credibility. So if Liz Truss does make, you know, a U-turn on all of her policies and everything that she stood for for the leadership, then why on earth is she still remain as Prime Minister?
I mean, that is an issue, isn't it, John? Because her whole leadership campaign was about cutting taxes, about this plan for growth on the back of the taxes. We're supposed to be having this economic statement no longer from Kwasi Kwarteng on the 31st of October. Does that all go?
Well, it looks like it, but the whole point of a Prime Minister is to be a leader and set a direction for the country. She set a direction for the country. It's ended up in a total mess. I just think it's only a couple of weeks ago, Liz Truss was saying that all of these policies in the mini-budget were essential for growth and saying anyone who didn't back them was part of the anti-growth coalition. And now she's implementing the policies that she said was awful. It's really hard to see how she patches things back together again.
Tony?
Yeah, I wondered, does she now think that Kwasi Kwarteng was part of the anti-growth coalition? Was he a sort of
It's getting bigger, the anti-growth coalition.
Sleeper agent all along. But yeah, I mean, I think another problem for her, as you say, is what her mandate is now. I mean, she already doesn't have a mandate from the country to be Prime Minister. The way it works in this country is that the Conservative Party chooses its own leader, so the number of people who elected her is very small, but on a set of policies that she has, in some cases, now abandoned. So it's hard to see where the Democratic mandate for her is.
And the polling that we saw, I think it was yesterday, showed that more than 60% of Conservative voters believe that the Conservative Party made a mistake in selecting her.
Oh, well, I mean, they may have buyer's remorse in that sense. The expression lame duck Prime Minister, would you use that phrase for Liz Truss now, Charlotte?
It's remarkable to do so because, in theory, she has a majority of about 80, and that just doesn't seem to be working in practice at all. I remember waking up in the morning at Tory conference, seeing that U-turn on the 45p rate of tax, perched myself outside the conference centre, tapping away on my laptop, writing, and past comes a government minister who was looking very distressed about the whole thing and said, look, the problem with this budget, or this mini-budget, is it made us look incompetent. Well, now we've doubled down on incompetence by U-turning, so we haven't fixed the problem. Then past comes a backbencher, glee in their eyes, saying, fantastic, we now know that we can force a U-turn when we want to, and we're going to do it again. And he pointed towards the universal credit uplift, but obviously we're seeing he didn't even have to wait that long.
All right, I mean, we have got other policies like of increasing benefits in line with inflation rather than earnings. There have also been discussions this week with Conservative MPs here in this studio saying that actually perhaps there should be a delay to the cut in the basic rate of income tax, another key policy, and perhaps the only one that might remain would be the reversal of the national insurance contributions increase. Do you think that's a possibility?
I think we're expecting the income tax cut to still be the government's policy this afternoon. I think in that press conference, I mean, it's possible that it could be delayed, of course, but these aren't the only policies that some Tory MPs are cross about as well. We've got to remember that there are also Tory MPs that are working with Labour to try and stop the government bringing back fracking. So that's another issue that could come to the Commons in the next couple of weeks. We've got the issue with the benefits uplift. Does it rise in line with inflation or in line with earnings? There are what one source described to me as about 4 or 5 different pressure points on the government where they think they can drive a wedge between the party and the government. And, you know, while we say that Liz Truss has got a majority of 80 seats, it only takes 35 Tory MPs to vote against the government, and they've got a defeat in the Commons, and then it starts to look really dangerous.
You just look back to the results of the Tory leadership contest. In that last round of voting of Tory MPs, she only scraped into the final 2 by a few votes. She got less than a third of the votes of Tory MPs. So there's lots of Tory MPs who aren't natural Liz Truss backers. and you really struggle to see how she manages to bring them on side now. And a lot of them will think, you know, a lot of people got sacked in that reshuffle. There's a lot of former ministers on the backbenches who, whether they're right or wrong, think they would be better in cabinet. And they're now thinking the only way that I manage to restore my career and get back in a ministerial department is to get rid of Liz Truss. So they're just going to keep going and going and going until they manage to get rid of her.
I mean, if there is... Well, sorry, Emily, just before I come to it, I mean, if there is a calming, though, of the markets, which has been one of the major, or the major issue that has destabilised certainly the party and, to some extent, the economy, if that does calm down, Tory MPs are thinking about the next election, whenever that is going to be, probably in 2024, maybe they will just stick with Liz Truss, depending on who she brings in as Chancellor, particularly if she persuades somebody from perhaps the Rishi Sunak wing of the party. Can you see then a period of calm and stability?
I wouldn't quite go for calm and stability. I think we'd probably enter more into a war of attrition, whereby, as Tony was just discussing there, you have issue-by-issue defeats for the government from its own MPs. I would also add to that there is another fun side story for Liz Truss to contend with. You just heard from John and Tony about the various discontents who didn't agree with her initial policies. Well, actually, there are still some true believers who really did agree with her mini-budget, and they were telling me, some of them, that they would be furious if she U-turned. So now she's got another front opening up on that wharf for her to contend with.
Well, let's talk to our political editor, Chris Mason. Chris, we're expecting this press conference from Prime Minister Liz Truss, having agreed with her Chancellor that he's gone. What are we expecting her to say?
We're expecting it to chunks of that so-called mini-budget,
right.
Joe. That's the reality of what's going to happen this afternoon. There is no suggestion it's going to be anything other than that. Seems to me what is intriguing, there's a lot that's intriguing, but
yes.
One of the things that is particularly intriguing in the kind of choreography of today, if what is happening deserves that particular word and description, is when this news conference happens in the coming hours at some point this afternoon. Clearly, the first question, if this question isn't answered already by then, is who is the new Chancellor? So, yeah, that's the big question that the Prime Minister has to answer, where you would assume that absolutely central to that appointment would be somebody who was seen to be credible, because this is about a battle of credibility, isn't it, with her own party, the Conservative Party, with the electorate, of course, and indeed with those markets in the city. Now, there's a couple of people in Parliament who are former Chancellors who, on the face of it, you might look at their CVs and think, well, they've done the job, which would be a contributor, perhaps, to that sort of sense of credibility. One of them goes by the name of Rishi Sunak, so I think we can probably suspect that that's a job that he is not particularly keen on in the current circumstances. And the other is Sajid Javid. And then, of course, there's the thought that Liz Truss might have, which is that you bring in somebody who is close to you politically, you can get on with, and all the rest of it. So someone perhaps like Therese Coffey, the Health Secretary for England, the Deputy Prime Minister. But one assumes that they will want to answer that question before the likes of me and others ask it. And of course, if you are going to do a news conference on a Friday afternoon to try and study the markets, presumably you don't want the headline from that news conference to be that you haven't got a Chancellor.
Absolutely. As we know, vacuums in politics are very dangerous places to be, even if it is only a matter of hours, because the speculation, Chris, as we know, started yesterday, certainly with the U-turn on the corporation tax policy and then with the fate of Kwasi Kwarteng. You will know that there has been speculation over the last 24 hours about what could come in Kwasi Kwarteng's place. You mentioned Rishi Sunak, whether there would be some sort of unity ticket. Is all of that just fevered speculation?
There's a lot of fevered speculation. Of course, this is a postcode that is full of fevered speculation, even in the most serene and calm times. But what is different about it at the moment is the depth and breadth of it. So you speak to people at every level of the Conservative Party, from the cabinet down, and there are very serious conversations going on about how the next few weeks and months might pan out. So yesterday there were serious conversations about the career longevity in the Treasury of Kwasi Kwarteng. There are also serious conversations going on about the Prime Minister next door. And there are Conservatives who are thinking, how do we prop ourselves up in government? Now, some make the argument, and we should make this point, by the way, some make the argument they absolutely don't want to see a contest or a coronation, and that Liz Truss has won an election to be Conservative leader and Prime Minister, and she should be allowed to carry on, even if there is some sort of reformulation of her whole outlook on how she's going to do the job. Perhaps an acceptance that, yes, she has a brand of politics within conservatism, but it hasn't worked, it hasn't appealed to a sufficient number of people, and so she'll tack to a different place and build a team that reflects that. There are also those who make the argument that she is so shot through credibility-wise, and the polls are tanking and the pound is tanking, all that stuff, and therefore someone else will have to come in. But among the contingent that are openly talking about an alternative Prime Minister, the vast majority say, look, what you cannot have is a situation where there is a contest, as we had over the summer, and Conservative Party members are involved and all the rest of it, because it just takes forever, and that would be literally incredible. So getting to a point, even if this Prime Minister were to want to go or was forced out, where there was that single unity candidate in a party that isn't screaming unity at the moment, is a pretty difficult place to get to, even for those who'd want to get to it.
I mean, as you say, the issue of mandate is important. It's particularly so over the last few weeks. And today, Liz Truss has got to try and pull almost an impossible trick to calm the markets, calm her party and calm voters. I mean, is it possible for her to divorce herself from the economic prospectus that was set out by Kwasi Kwarteng when it was the very basis of the leadership campaign that she ran in the summer? And many of her supporters say, so we shouldn't be surprised by what was unveiled. Yes, maybe the way it was unveiled, but not what was unveiled in that mini budget, ill-fated as it now turns out to be, on the 23rd of September.
Yeah, I mean, there's no doubt that what the Prime Minister will have to do this afternoon will be humiliating. I mean, that is just a baked-in reality of having to hold a press conference on a day that you've lost your Chancellor and you're junking another element, however big or small what is coming is, another element of your prospectus for government. Because it wasn't just a quote-unquote mini-budget. This was the rollout of Liz Truss's, as you say, prospectus for government that she had campaigned on. Yes, there was elements of it that were a surprise, but certainly those big tax cuts were pre-announced and were the central dividing line between her and Rishi Sunak over the summer. So that will be deeply, deeply uncomfortable. The question for her politically will be, if she junks a lot of that stuff economically and that can contribute to calming the markets, is she willing to tack to a different place politically, perhaps make an argument that says, look, I'm a pragmatist, I'm a Conservative first, I have to govern from a different place within Conservatism from the one that is my home, but I respect that there isn't a overwhelming sort of desire for that at the moment, and you sort of build a team to reflect that and try and carry on. I guess that's one option. If you want to carry on, you have to be pragmatic and try and build a team that can ensure your party and the markets and more broadly the country will allow that to happen.
Chris Mason, BBC's political editor, thank you very much. Well, in just over an hour's time, we are expecting Liz Truss to speak at that press conference. She'll be asked all these sorts of questions. Let's go back to the moment at the beginning of the programme to remind viewers it is only just over 4 weeks ago that Liz Truss did become Prime Minister. She's going to have an awful lot to do and say at 2 o'clock. You remember, Charlotte, at the Tory party conference, both Kwasi Kwarteng as Chancellor and Liz Truss saying, I get it, I've heard, I've listened, and we're changing things. We are going to be pragmatic. Is that going to wash, do you think, this afternoon?
I think there's the question of whether it will wash with the markets. We've heard that the markets are somewhat stable today relative to where they have been. There's a question of whether it will wash with voters. Obviously, the Conservatives are really, really struggling in the polls at the moment. 19% last night. That is an absolutely remarkable number. And this is meant to be their honeymoon period. I think it will be very tricky for Liz Truss to come back on that front. John Curtis, the polling expert, talking about this as essentially a situation that is impossible to come back from yesterday. Then there's a question of whether this washes with Conservative MPs, and I think that's probably the most immediate threat. We're not going to get a general election tomorrow. Conservative MPs, I think, will be watching this afternoon like a hawk. There is a real sense that they need Liz Truss to get a grip and to present a full agenda for government. I don't think this U-turn by itself will cut the mustard. What is saving her is the fact that Conservative MPs at the moment do not seem to be able to find someone else they all want to unite behind.
Well, and that is always the issue, isn't it? Finding consensus around a replacement, if it were to come to that, in the way that perhaps Boris Johnson was when Theresa May ran into difficulties. And that is still very much the case now.
Yes, that is the problem, and you have to say, well, if you were approached by a group of Conservative backbenchers who said to you, do you fancy being Prime Minister at the moment? And you may well say, no, actually, I don't really, because it's going to be pretty difficult to turn it round. The thing that Tory MPs are trying to avoid is a general election, because there is a feeling at the moment with the current position in the polls that if there was to be a general election now, it would be a complete landslide for Labour. So I think the game plan from a Tory MP's point of view is to hold out for as long as possible, hope the markets recover, hope that their polling position recovers. And I was talking to one senior minister this week who said that they felt that if Liz Truss was able to calm the markets this week, that perhaps by Christmas the party could be in a better position. Perhaps 6 months after that they might be safe enough to go to the country. But for the time being, that it's a bit of a race, I think, to find someone.
It must be so frustrating for you, Emily Thornberry, to be in opposition at a time when you can't affect a general election, you know, easily. You would need Conservative MPs to join you in some sort of no-confidence motion. You are said to be, across a spread of polls, anything between 17 and 30 points ahead. Is any of it down to what Labour is doing, or is it all in reaction to what's happening within the Conservatives?
I genuinely think that what's most frustrating is that we can't influence policy. I mean, we try and we do occasionally.
Well, you did. I mean, you got your freeze on the energy gap. You got your windfall tax initially. One could say you have influenced policy,
but not enough. Not in the way that we could do if we were in charge now. That's the point. And do you remember, I mean, listening to the conversation that we're having now, I just remember just a few months back, you know, when Boris Johnson was found guilty of breaking the law, and Tory MPs were telling us now wasn't the time to get rid of the Prime Minister and get another one because we were at war. Do you remember that? Mm. You know, and now these are the same Tory MPs who are rushing around trying to find someone to replace the Prime Minister, and that will be the third Prime Minister in 2 months.
John?
I think the problem Tory MPs have got, well, they've got loads of problems, but one of the main ones is that if they try and replace the Prime Minister, we end up with a Tory leadership election. That would leave a massive vacuum. It would be like the summer when nothing was happening with energy bills, and it took on and on and on, went on forever. If they try and avoid that and just do some sort of coronation, number one, it's really hard for them to agree on who they're going to pick. They all hate each other. They all have different factions. I've struggled to see who they're going to suddenly all coalesce around. But if they do that, then I think there'll be questions from the public about who exactly has voted for this. We've seen that with Liz Truss. People kept saying, who has voted for this? You know, that's the line that Labour have repeatedly used, said, no one's voted for this. Who's voted for this? And the answer with Liz Truss was about 80,000 Tory members. If you get another PM who's just been appointed, hasn't even been appointed through a vote of Tory members or MPs, they've literally just been handpicked and pushed in. And I think that will increase pressure for a general election. I think a lot of people around the country will think, what on earth, when did we have our say about these policies that have been picked by the government?
Well, you raised the issue again of a general election. Emily Thornberry, now is the time for Labour to be setting out concrete plans beyond what we've heard at party conference. What would you do, let's say Labour is in power next week, to calm the markets? What would you do about the level of borrowing? Give us some of the policies that Labour would take right now and change the country.
You see, here we are. We don't know what the government is about to do. They have no idea, as far as I can tell, that you can't even get a Conservative MP to come on now to tell you what their policy is.
And I'm glad you reminded me of that. We did ask the government, of course, for a minister, but none was available.
But so we don't even know what it is that we're responding to. We don't know what the state of the economy will be. We haven't had the OBR.
That sounds very reactive, Emily Thornberry, because the Labour Party can see the Labour Party can still have a firm narrative when it comes to the economy.
Yes.
And instead of reacting to what has been set out by what you see as a sort of defunct Conservative government, surely there must be now more concrete policies for the public to look at, to give you a hearing and to say, yes, we'd like you in. What would they be?
So the first thing is we do need to see what the OBR says about the state of the country's finances.
That's the Office of Budget Responsibility. So some scrutiny of the...
And they are independent, and we can actually get to the truth of just how bad the situation is. We have set out some very radical critical and very important policies looking to the future, particularly around GB energy and the way in which we would ensure that we can cut our energy bills, we can become
including £28 billion a year on your climate policies,
yes,
adding to borrowing, which would probably be still in the next few years in the region of around £100 billion.
And that would be within real fiscal rules that we would stick to. So you borrow in order to invest. You never borrow in order to cut taxes. I mean, that just is not the way that you do it. And you would get another government that the people would have some faith in. We need to have a change. We cannot go on like this. We need to have responsible finances. We need to have strong fiscal rules. And we need to have fair long-term growth with a real plan for it.
All right, well, let's have a look at this tweet from the political editor at Newsnight, Nicholas Watt. A group of senior Tories have been holding discussions and have decided the following. The sacking of Kwasi Kwarteng will prompt them to come out publicly next week and call on Liz Truss to resign. My source, these are serious people. The PM will find it difficult to survive. Charlotte Ivers, what do you make of that?
Well, it depends what Nick means by senior Tories, doesn't it? Because, of course, there are any number of different groups of people who are currently scurried away and plotting. Exactly. So that could be any number of different groups that he's speaking about there. I think it will be immensely tricky for Liz Truss over the next few days. All eyes, of course, will be on that press conference. And there are a lot of MPs, frankly, who just want all of this to go away. They are crying out for her to say something tonight, this afternoon, I should say, to reassure them, because they hope that that might stabilise the markets, that they can slope on through while they get their act together, while they work out what's next. Whereas if she cannot assuage those people who are a bit more moderate on her as an issue, then we may see something rather chaotic happening, I think.
But it's also the people outside the Westminster bubble. It's also those who are really worried about what their next mortgage demand is going to be. You know, whilst all of this chaos goes on and we talk about, you know, who's going to be Prime Minister, who isn't going to be Prime Minister, it's actually the reality of people's lives who have already got such a hard time. And this crisis was made in Downing Street. What are they going to do to get us out of it?
Well, in the meantime, I spoke to John Redwood earlier today. He's a supporter of Liz Truss. He said to me he thought it would be a mistake to reverse the corporation tax policy. And he said people need to calm down and stop panicking. Is he a lone voice?
Well, there are a few people in the Conservative Party who still think that, who think that these U-turns are a mistake, who still think that Liz Truss should have cut the additional rate of tax, the 45p rate. But those people clearly the markets aren't in agreement with those people, are they? The markets find these policies to be worrying. So, no, I mean, the thing we have to remember about John Redwood, of course, is he was tipped to be a Treasury Minister under the Liz Truss administration. It was written that he was very close to the economic discussions that were happening between her and Kwasi Kwarteng, Jacob Rees-Mogg. But that job did never materialise, and he does remain a backbencher. So, you know, you have to wonder quite how close John Redwood necessarily is to these discussions. But he does represent a constituency of the Conservative Party, and he's probably one of those who's actually got the backbone to come out and say it, because a lot of the MPs who are off that view know that it's quite unpopular and perhaps wouldn't say it at the moment. Well,
and Conservative MPs, of course, are in their constituencies, aren't they? Today and over the weekend, Charlotte Ivers, many of them may well be talking to their constituency parties and their chairman.
Yes, and again, that's rather interesting because a lot of Conservative members, of course, backed Liz Truss very recently and they still support her. Actually, I've heard from some MPs who have been publicly or privately critical of Liz Truss, who have been told by their members to put a sock in it, frankly, because they said, well, we only voted for this about a month ago, give her a chance. So those pressures will be going in both directions from the party members this weekend.
All right, well, as I say, we've only got a few minutes left on the programme, and then we are expecting this afternoon, perhaps not precise timings, for that press conference of Liz Truss. There's going to be a lot more scrutiny on Labour, isn't there, John? A lot more than there has been perhaps over the last year or so, because Emily Thornberry has said that actually it's up to the government to sort out the current sort of predicament and turmoil in the economy. But there will be a lot more scrutiny on their plans too.
There'll definitely be a lot more scrutiny on Labour, and we've already seen that. You know, there was a lot more tension at Labour Party conference this year on what Labour was announcing rather than the fights that we've had in the past. You know, there are a lot of journalists in Westminster who are suddenly trying to improve their contacts with people like Emily and her colleagues because they do think that Labour Party could be in power and they want to know what exactly would they do differently. for in power in government. But I think, this afternoon, the main thing is going to be for Liz Truss to set her agenda for the country. There are a lot of MPs out there. She might be ditching these policies, but which ones is she going to bring in instead?
I'm just going to report to you before we go that Steve Swinford from The Times is reporting that Jeremy Hunt could well be the next Chancellor. But it is only speculation at the moment. That's all we have time for from all of our guests. Thank you and goodbye.